1. 10,000 years ago, on the shores of what is now Lake Turkana in Kenya, a group of people went about an ordinary day. They fished with simple bone hooks. They gathered plants along the water's edge. Children played in the shallows while the adults worked, the way children always have. 2. There was no reason to think this day would be different from any other in their lives, or in the lives of their parents, or their parents before them. This was a rich place to live. Fish, waterfowl, wild plants, fresh water. For hunter-gatherers, it was about as good as life got. 3. By the end of that day, at least 27 of them were dead. Not from disease, not from accident, from other human beings. 4. This is the story of Nataruk, a place that some archaeologists believe holds the earliest clear evidence of organized violence between two groups of humans. Not a single fight, not one person killing another in anger. Something bigger and far more deliberate. 5. It's a story about bones, about broken skulls, shattered hands, and stone points still lodged where they struck. And it forces us to ask one of the biggest questions in human history. When did we start going to war with each other? Was it always part of who we are, or did something have to change first? 6. In 2012, a research team led by paleoanthropologist Marta Mirazon-La was surveying the Badlands west of Lake Turkana, a region already famous among paleontologists for its rich fossil record stretching back millions of years. Near a dried-up lagoon, now called Nataruk, they found something that had nothing to do with deep evolutionary time. It was recent, it was human, and it was disturbing. 7. Scattered across the old lake bed were human remains, at least 12 nearly complete skeletons, along with scattered bones suggesting a total of 27 or more individuals, men and women, adults and children. These weren't burials. There were no grave goods, no careful positioning of the bodies, no signs that anyone had come back afterward to lay them to rest. They had simply been left where they fell, out in the open, on the edge of what was once a thriving lagoon. 8. The condition of the remains told a brutal story. Several skulls showed clear, blunt force trauma, the kind of fracture pattern caused by a heavy object striking the head with lethal force, consistent with clubs or similarly weighted weapons. Other individuals showed sharp force injuries, and most tellingly, embedded directly in the bone of at least 2 people, were fragments of obsidian, a volcanic glass that flakes into razor-sharp edges, driven in with enough force to lodge permanently. One point was found still inside a skull. Another sat in a chest cavity, exactly where the ribs meet the sternum. 9. At least one woman, believed to be in the late stages of pregnancy, was found with her hands and possibly her feet bound. Of everything at the site, this is the detail that lingers. Binding takes time, it takes control. It means someone wasn't just killed in the heat of a chaotic clash. They were restrained first, deliberately, by people who had the upper hand and chose to use it. 10. Taken together, the researchers who studied Nataruk drew a striking conclusion. This appeared to be evidence of intergroup conflict, violence carried out by one band of hunter-gatherers against another, dating back roughly 10,000 years. If that interpretation holds, Nataruk stands as the oldest scientifically documented instance of organized group violence anywhere in the human archaeological record. 11. A claim like that invites scrutiny, and it has received plenty. Some researchers have questioned whether every injury happened in the same event, suggesting that 10,000 years of sediment pressure and water movement could account for some of the skeletal damage rather than deliberate violence. Others have asked whether this was one coordinated attack or several unrelated deaths that happened to end up preserved in the same spot. But even the more cautious voices in this debate tend to agree on one point. The embedded obsidian projectile points are very hard to explain as anything other than the result of one human being attacking another. 12. So was Nataruk war? That depends entirely on what we mean by the word. Most anthropologists reserve war for something more structured than a single violent event, organized conflict between defined groups, often repeated over time, usually tied to a strategic goal like territory, resources, or revenge. A singular brutal encounter, however devastating, is more accurately described as a massacre or a raid. War implies a pattern. It implies two groups that see each other as ongoing rivals, not people who simply cross paths badly on one particular day. 13. To understand why that distinction matters, we need to look at how most humans actually lived for the vast majority of our history, as small, mobile hunter-gatherer bands, rarely more than a few dozen people, following food and water across the landscape, rather than staying in one place. And that mobility changed the entire math around conflict. If your group's wealth is whatever you can carry on your back, there's very little worth stealing. If your territory is simply wherever the animals happen to be this season, there's very little fixed ground worth dying to defend. 14. None of this means prehistoric people were peaceful by nature. Interpersonal violence, feuds, revenge killings, the occasional raid like the one seemingly captured at Nataruk almost certainly happened throughout human history. Humans have never been free of aggression, but the kind of sustained, organized warfare we associate with later periods of history, standing conflicts, territorial campaigns, settlements under repeated siege, required something that most nomadic foraging societies simply didn't have: a fixed, defensible, valuable resource base worth fighting over again and again. 15. That changed with agriculture. Starting around 12,000 years ago, in different parts of the world, human groups began shifting from foraging to farming, what archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution. And this shift changed almost everything about how people lived, including, many researchers argue, how and why they fought. Farming meant staying put. Fields don't move. Once land is cleared, planted and harvested, and grain is stored for the lean months, a community is tied to that spot in a way no nomadic band ever was. 16. That fixed investment changed the calculation entirely. Suddenly there was something worth defending and something worth stealing: stored grain, livestock, irrigated fields, permanent homes representing months or years of accumulated labor, sitting in one vulnerable, immobile place. For a neighboring group facing a bad harvest or growing too large for its own land, raiding a nearby settlement's stores could mean the difference between surviving the winter and starving through it. At the same time, farming supported far denser populations than foraging ever could, which meant more people, competing for the best land and the most reliable water, population pressure, and fixed resources together, which is exactly the combination that makes organized, repeated, conflict rational from a group's point of view. 17. This is why most researchers who study the origins of warfare point to the period between roughly 12,000 and 10,000 years ago as the real turning point, not because violence itself began then, but because the conditions that turn occasional violence into sustained, organized warfare took hold then. Farming created territory worth defending. Surplus created wealth worth stealing. Permanent settlement created targets that could no longer simply walk away from trouble. Seen through that lens, Nataruk sits right at an interesting hinge point in the story. The people found there were still hunter-gatherers, but they lived beside a lake unusually rich in resources, abundant enough to support something close to a settled lifestyle. Some researchers see this as the exception that proves the rule. Wherever resources became concentrated and worth defending, the potential for organized violence followed, even before farming existed. 18. Nataruk isn't the only ancient site raising these questions. Along the Nile in Sudan, a cemetery known as Jebel Sahaba, dated to a broadly similar era, though its exact age has been debated and revised more than once, contains numerous individuals showing signs of violent death, including several with stone projectile points still embedded in their bones. For decades, Jebel Sahaba was widely considered the oldest evidence of warfare in the archaeological record. More recent analysis suggests its burials may represent violence that built up gradually over a longer stretch of time, rather than a single event, which would actually point to something different from Nataruk. Not one massacre, but a slow, repeated pattern of hostility in that region, closer to what we genuinely call war. 19. So where does that leave Nataruk? Most careful researchers today don't call it proof of the First War. They call it a snapshot, one devastating, remarkably well-preserved moment of intergroup violence, sitting right at the edge of the transition that would, over the following millennia, turn organized warfare into a regular feature of human life. It shows that the capacity for coordinated, brutal violence between groups existed even before farming, even before permanent settlements, even before the large-scale territorial disputes we usually associate with the word war. But it also shows that such violence among hunter-gatherers seems to have been rare enough, that this one site stands out dramatically, rather than being one of many. If organised killing had been common among late Stone Age foragers, we'd expect to find dozens of sites like it. We don't. We find a small handful, each debated, each sitting at the edge of what a few unusual conditions made possible. 20? What Nataruk really tells us then is something more nuanced than a headline about the First War. It tells us that the potential for organised human violence long predates agriculture. That under the right conditions, even mobile hunter-gatherer bands were capable of premeditated, coordinated killing. And it supports the broader pattern archaeologists see again and again, that as humans began to settle, farm, store surplus, and defend fixed territory, that potential for violence stopped being an occasional situational event and became something structured, recurring, and eventually institutionalized, what we now simply call war. 10,000 years later, we still live with the consequences of that shift. The line from a fishing camp on the shore of an ancient African lake to the armies and battlefields of recorded history isn't a straight one, but it runs, unmistakably, through moments like this one. Thanks for joining me on the long walk of human history. I'll see you on the next one.